The courtroom was quiet, but it was filled with a palpable tension. Every person in that room felt the weight of what was about to unfold. The gavel had just come down, signaling that the judge had called the room to attention. The scene was set for what many would call a historic moment. In one corner, there was a black male judge, his posture rigid, eyes sharp with focus. His authority in the courtroom was clear, and he had earned his position through years of experience and dedication to fairness. His robes, dark and dignified, seemed to amplify his commanding presence. At the defendant's table, there was an officer, young, blonde, and brimming with confidence. She sat there with her arms crossed, an unmistakable smirk on her face. She had always been someone who prided herself on being in control, and today, that confidence had turned into arrogance. Her demeanor suggested she thought she was untouchable. The officer had been caught in a compromising situation. She had disrespected not just anyone, but a judge, someone who stood as a symbol of authority and justice. Around her, the room was divided. Some looked on in disbelief, others in anger. They all knew that the officer's attitude was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about respect, dignity, and the role that everyone played in upholding the integrity of the court. The judge had noticed it immediately. The officer's behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was an outright challenge to his authority. The judge had heard many things over his years on the bench, but never had he encountered such blatant disrespect. The officer had smiled during his remarks, as though she believed the law didn't apply to her. Her laughter echoed in the room, as if mocking the very system that he, as a judge, had sworn to protect. The room seemed to freeze for a moment as everyone held their breath. It was clear that this was no ordinary case, it had become a matter of principle. The officer's actions were a slap in the face to everything the judge stood for. He had seen many things in his years of service, difficult cases, emotional testimonies, and high-stakes decisions. But this was different. The officer's arrogance had ignited something inside him, something that went beyond his role as a judge. This was personal. He couldn't let this disrespect go unanswered. As he gazed down at the officer, his mind was working fast. What kind of person would mock the very system that had given her everything? It was a moment that would define his character and his legacy. He knew he had to make a statement, not just for her, but for everyone who might think they could disrespect the courts without consequence. The officer, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued to sit there, grinning, thinking she was in control of the situation. She had been in countless situations before, and in each one, her authority had never been questioned. But today, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an air of finality in the room, an energy that suggested the balance of power was about to shift. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. His words were sharp, calculated. "That kind of behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his conviction. For a moment, the officer blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone being called out so directly. But there was something in the judge's eyes, something that made her realize this was different. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. She had heard of judges who let small things slide, those who overlooked minor offenses, but she quickly realized that this judge was not one of those people. His gaze was unyielding, his composure unshaken. She could feel the room's attention focused on her, and for the first time in her life, she felt vulnerable. She was no longer the one in control. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The officer's arrogance had set the stage for something much larger than herself. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for the system itself. The judge had made up his mind, and there was no going back. The officer's laughter and disrespect had ignited something in him that could no longer be ignored. The officer, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued to sit there, grinning, thinking she was in control of the situation. She had been in countless situations before, and in each one, her authority had never been questioned. But today, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an air of finality in the room, an energy that suggested the balance of power was about to shift. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. His words were sharp, calculated. "That kind of behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his conviction. For a moment, the officer blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone being called out so directly. But there was something in the judge's eyes, something that made her realize this was different. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. She had heard of judges who let small things slide, those who overlooked minor offenses, but she quickly realized that this judge was not one of those people. His gaze was unyielding, his composure unshaken. She could feel the room's attention focused on her, and for the officer, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued to sit there, grinning, thinking she was in control of the situation. She had been in countless situations before, and in each one, her authority had never been questioned. But today, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an air of finality in the room, an energy that suggested the balance of power was about to shift. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. His words were sharp, calculated. "That kind of behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his conviction. For a moment, the officer blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone being called out so directly. But there was something in the judge's eyes, something that made her realize this was different. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. She had heard of judges who let small things slide, those who overlooked minor offenses, but she quickly realized that this judge was not one of those people. His gaze was unyielding, his composure unshaken. She could feel the room's attention focused on her, and for the first time in her life, she felt vulnerable. She was no longer the one in control. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The officer's arrogance had set the stage for something much larger than herself. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for the system itself. The judge had made up his mind, and there was no going back. The officer's laughter and disrespect had ignited something in him that could no longer be ignored. The officer, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued to sit there, grinning, thinking she was in control of the situation. She had been in countless situations before, and in each one, her authority had never been questioned. But today, something felt different. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was an air of finality in the room, an energy that suggested the balance of power was about to shift. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. His words were sharp, calculated. "That kind of behavior will not be tolerated in my courtroom," he said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his conviction. For a moment, the officer blinked, taken aback. She wasn't used to being challenged, let alone being called out so directly. But there was something in the judge's eyes, something that made her realize this was different. She had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. She had heard of judges who let small things slide, those who overlooked minor offenses, but she quickly realized that this judge was not one of those people. His gaze was unyielding, his composure unshaken. She could feel the room's attention focused on her, and for the first time in her life, she felt vulnerable. She was no longer the one in control. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. The officer's arrogance had set the stage for something much larger than herself. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for the system itself. The judge had made up his mind, and there was no going back. The officer's laughter and disrespect had ignited something in him that could no longer be ignored. This was a battle of wills, a test of character, and it was far from over. The officer had no idea what was coming next, but everyone in the courtroom could feel that the moment of truth was near. The judge was about to show her and everyone else in the room just how powerful the law, and his verdict, could be. The officer sat back in her chair, trying to compose herself after the judge's stern words. It was hard to ignore the gravity of the situation, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that she could get away with whatever she wanted. She was, after all, an officer, someone who had earned respect in other areas of her life. Why should a judge be any different? She let out a small chuckle, as though to dismiss the tension that had filled the room. But no one else seemed to share in her amusement. The judge, unperturbed by her laugh, leaned forward slightly. His sharp eyes never left her. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, but it never failed to frustrate him. She wasn't just disrespecting him, she was disrespecting the entire judicial system, the one thing he had worked so hard to uphold. And that, to him, was far more significant than any personal offense. His hands rested firmly on the desk, fingers interlaced, his posture reflecting the quiet strength of someone who had long been in charge. The courtroom was eerily silent, as if everyone knew the significance of what was about to happen. The officer's casual demeanor contrasted sharply with the seriousness of the situation, and it was clear that she wasn't fully grasping the weight of the judge's presence. The judge's voice cut through the silence again, steady and unflinching. "I've seen arrogance before," he began, each word resonating with authority. "But it's one thing to mock the law from the outside. It's another to do it within the very walls where justice is meant to be served. You've crossed a line, and now you'll face the consequences." The officer's smirk faded slightly as she heard his words. This wasn't the usual back and forth that she was used to. She had been in tough situations before, with criminals, with colleagues who challenged her authority. But this judge wasn't like any of them. This was a man of principle, someone who understood the deeper implications of his position. She had underestimated him, and now, she realized, she might have made a grave mistake. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. She wasn't prepared for this. She had expected to be able to talk her way out of it, to charm her way through the tension, to laugh off the judge's words. But nothing she did seemed to have any effect on him. The judge's unwavering stare made it clear that he wasn't going to bend, no matter how much she tried to assert herself. The room felt colder now. The other people present, witnesses, attorneys, and spectators, watched with bated breath, sensing that this was no ordinary courtroom drama. They understood that this wasn't just about a simple disrespect. It was about the core values of justice, the very foundation of the law. And the officer's behavior had threatened to undermine it all. The judge took a moment to let his words sink in, the silence growing thicker with each passing second. His expression remained calm, but his eyes burned with the conviction of someone who had long been committed to his role. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was a symbol of the law, and he wouldn't let anyone tarnish that. He finally spoke again, his voice low but heavy with meaning. "You will leave this courtroom with a very different understanding of what it means to be in a place of power. And let this be a lesson to you, that power is never to be taken for granted, nor is it to be abused." The officer's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She was not accustomed to being put in her place. Her reputation, built over years of working in law enforcement, had always been one of control, of never backing down in the face of challenge. But this situation was unlike any she had encountered before. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Her instincts told her to lash out, to argue, to fight for her pride. But something in the judge's demeanor made her hesitate. He wasn't trying to humiliate her, he was simply showing her the weight of his position. And for the first time, she understood the full extent of what she had done. It wasn't just a matter of disrespecting a man, it was about dishonoring the very institution that kept society in balance. The courtroom's tension grew as the judge paused again. He wasn't done yet. The officer had made her statement, but now it was his turn to make his. He was going to send a message that would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. "Let me make this clear," the judge continued, his voice carrying through the room with the force of an unstoppable current. "Respect for the law is the foundation of everything we do in here. Without it, we are nothing. And while you may have come into this courtroom thinking you were above the rules, I assure you that no one is." The officer clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She wanted to argue, to protest, but the judge's words seemed to have cut her off at every turn. She had been outplayed, and she knew it. The idea of being humiliated like this was hard for her to accept. But deep down, a small part of her understood that she was facing the consequences of her own actions. The judge turned to the rest of the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over everyone present. It wasn't just the officer who needed to hear his words. It was everyone. The audience, the lawyers, the witnesses, they all needed to understand the message he was sending. "This is about more than just one person," the judge said, his voice now ringing with authority. "This is about upholding what is right. This is about standing up for what is fair, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's difficult." There was a palpable shift in the room. The audience, who had been watching with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, now felt a sense of unity in the judge's words. It was as if he had reminded them of something they had all forgotten, something fundamental about the importance of justice. The officer, still seething with a sense of humiliation, was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. Her bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a feeling of vulnerability. She had no choice but to listen now, to accept the reality of her actions. And while the shame she felt was overwhelming, it also began to sink in that this moment could be the turning point in her career. As the judge prepared to deliver his final verdict, the room held its collective breath. Everyone in that courtroom understood that this wasn't just about a single officer's misstep. It was about justice being served. It was about the system working as it should, without bias, without compromise. And in that moment, it was clear that the judge was determined to ensure that the balance of power remained where it belonged, in the hands of the law. The officer, for the first time in a long while, was no longer in control. And that thought weighed heavily on her. It was a humbling experience, one that she would not soon forget. The court had spoken, and now she would have to face the consequences. But what those consequences would be, she could not yet imagine. The room was filled with an air of suspense, as though everyone in it was holding their breath. The officer, still trying to maintain her composure, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The judge's gaze never wavered, as though he had already made his decision. She had never felt so exposed in her life, and a sense of dread began to creep up her spine. The judge cleared his throat and looked around the courtroom one last time, ensuring that everyone was paying attention. His eyes locked onto the officers, and for the first time, she saw something in them that made her stomach churn: determination. It wasn't just a decision he was about to make, it was a statement, a lesson. The officer's earlier confidence seemed to shrink in size under the weight of that gaze. "Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful," the judge began, his voice steady and unwavering. "You came in here thinking you could mock the law, thinking that your position gave you the right to disrespect those who enforce it. But let me remind you, this court is not about personal pride. It is about fairness. It is about justice." Each word felt like a hammer falling, driving deeper into the officer's chest. She had heard criticism before, sure, but never like this. The judge wasn't just angry, he was hurt, disappointed. And in that moment, the officer understood that this was not just about her actions, this was about the trust that had been broken. She had not just insulted the judge. She had insulted everything the law stood for. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her usual sharp retorts, her clever defenses, were nowhere to be found. She was trapped in the silence, surrounded by the weight of the judge's words and the eyes of everyone in the room. Her confidence, which had carried her so far in her career, was now all but gone. She had been caught in a trap of her own making, and now she had nowhere to hide. The judge continued, not allowing her to speak, as though he knew that her attempts at defense would only serve to undermine what had already been made clear. The court has seen many who believe they are above the law. But what they fail to understand is that no one is invincible. We all have a responsibility to uphold the dignity of this institution, and you have failed that responsibility. The officer's face flushed with a mixture of shame and frustration. How had she let this happen? She was trained for tough situations. She had faced dangerous criminals, handled high-pressure moments, and navigated complex cases. But this was something entirely different. This was personal, and in that moment, she felt utterly powerless. The judge's voice softened just slightly, but it held the same unwavering authority. I'm not here to make an example out of you. I'm here to remind you that respect is earned, not demanded. And more importantly, I'm here to make it clear that no one, regardless of their title or position, is beyond accountability. The officer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the other people in the room. They were all watching, some with judgment, others with pity. She could see it in their faces. They knew she had made a mistake, and now it was too late to take it back. There was no excuse, no quick way out of this. The judge paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. The room was still, waiting. It was as though time itself had slowed down. The officer had never felt so small, so insignificant. She had lived her life with a sense of invincibility, but now she was confronted with the stark reality that no one was above reproach. Finally, the judge's hand moved toward the gavel, and the moment of decision arrived. He looked at the officer one last time, his expression unwavering, and spoke the words that would change everything. The court has spoken, the judge declared. You will be held accountable for your actions. You are hereby suspended from your duties as an officer of the law. You will undergo a thorough review of your conduct and the impact it has had on the integrity of your position. This is not just a punishment, it is an opportunity for reflection. I expect you to take that opportunity seriously. The words hit the officer like a ton of bricks. Suspended? The reality of it all hadn't fully set in until now. She had worked so hard to build her career, to earn the trust of her colleagues and the public. And now, in an instant, it was all on the line. The thought of being suspended, of having her entire professional life put on hold, was almost too much to bear. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, and for the first time, she didn't know how to react. She wanted to argue, to fight against the judgment, but the judge had made it clear, this was final. There would be no second chances, no easy way out. Her actions had consequences, and now she would have to face them. The officer opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She wanted to plead her case, to explain herself, but she knew deep down that there was nothing more to say. The damage had been done, and now she would have to live with it. As the gavel fell, marking the official end of the proceedings, the officer's world seemed to collapse in on itself. She stood there, motionless, as the judge's words echoed in her mind. Suspended. The weight of that single word carried so much more than just a temporary leave of absence. It meant a public reprimand, it meant questioning her career, and it meant that the very thing she had worked for, her authority, was now in question. Part 3, the verdict is delivered. The room was filled with an air of suspense, as though everyone in it was holding their breath. The officer, still trying to maintain her composure, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The judge's gaze never wavered, as though he had already made his decision. She had never felt so exposed in her life, and a sense of dread began to creep up her spine. The judge cleared his throat and looked around the courtroom one last time, ensuring that everyone was paying attention. His eyes locked onto the officers, and for the first time, she saw something in them that made her stomach churn: determination. It wasn't just a decision he was about to make, it was a statement, a lesson. The officer's earlier confidence seemed to shrink in size under the weight of that gaze. "Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful," the judge began, his voice steady and unwavering. "You came in here thinking you could mock the law, thinking that your position gave you the right to disrespect those who enforce it. But let me remind you, this court is not about personal pride. It is about fairness. It is about justice." Each word felt like a hammer falling, driving deeper into the officer's chest. She had heard criticism before, sure, but never like this. The judge wasn't just angry, he was hurt, disappointed. And in that moment, the officer understood that this was not just about her actions, this was about the trust that had been broken. She had not just insulted the judge. She had insulted everything the law stood for. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her usual sharp retorts, her clever defenses, were nowhere to be found. She was trapped in the silence, surrounded by the weight of the judge's words and the eyes of everyone in the room. Her confidence, which had carried her so far in her career, was now all but gone. She had been caught in a trap of her own making, and now she had nowhere to hide. The judge continued, not allowing her to speak, as though he knew that her attempts at defense would only serve to undermine what had already been made clear. The court has seen many who believe they are above the law. But what they fail to understand is that no one is invincible. We all have a responsibility to uphold the dignity of this institution, and you have failed that responsibility. The officer's face flushed with a mixture of shame and frustration. How had she let this happen? She was trained for tough situations. She had faced dangerous criminals, handled high-pressure moments, and navigated complex cases. But this was something entirely different. This was personal, and in that moment, she felt utterly powerless. The judge's voice softened just slightly, but it held the same unwavering authority. "I'm not here to make an example out of you. I'm here to remind you that respect is earned, not demanded. And more importantly, I'm here to make it clear that no one, regardless of their title or position, is beyond accountability." The officer shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the other people in the room. They were all watching, some with judgment, others with pity. She could see it in their faces. They knew she had made a mistake, and now it was too late to take it back. There was no excuse, no quick way out of this. The judge paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. The room was still, waiting. It was as though time itself had slowed down. The officer had never felt so small, so insignificant. She had lived her life with a sense of invincibility, but now she was confronted with the stark reality that no one was above reproach. Finally, the judge's hand moved toward the gavel, and the moment of decision arrived. He looked at the officer one last time, his expression unwavering, and spoke the words that would change everything. "The court has spoken," the judge declared. "You will be held accountable for your actions. You are hereby suspended from your duties as an officer of the law. You will undergo a thorough review of your conduct and the impact it has had on the integrity of your position. This is not just a punishment, it is an opportunity for reflection. I expect you to take that opportunity seriously." The words hit the officer like a ton of bricks. Suspended? The reality of it all hadn't fully set in until now. She had worked so hard to build her career, to earn the trust of her colleagues and the public. And now, in an instant, it was all on the line. The thought of being suspended, of having her entire professional life put on hold, was almost too much to bear. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, and for the first time, she didn't know how to react. She wanted to argue, to fight against the judgment, but the judge had made it clear, this was final. There would be no second chances, no easy way out. Her actions had consequences, and now she would have to face them. The officer opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She wanted to plead her case, to explain herself, but she knew deep down that there was nothing more to say. The damage had been done, and now she would have to live with it. As the gavel fell, marking the official end of the proceedings, the officer's world seemed to collapse in on itself. She stood there, motionless, as the judge's words echoed in her mind. Suspended. The weight of that single word carried so much more than just a temporary leave of absence. It meant a public reprimand, it meant questioning her career, and it meant that the very thing she had worked for, her authority, was now in question. She had always believed that power came from her badge, from her uniform, from the respect she demanded from others. But now, standing in that courtroom, she realized that true power came from understanding, humility, and respect. And in that moment, she felt a deep sense of loss, not for her job, but for the person she had become. The judge's final words lingered in her mind. This is not just a punishment, it is an opportunity for reflection. He had given her a chance to change, to learn, and to rebuild her reputation. But the question was, would she take it? Could she take it? As the courtroom began to empty, the officer stood frozen in place, her mind racing. What had begun as a moment of arrogance had turned into a life-altering event. And now, as she slowly left the room, she couldn't help but wonder, could she ever regain the trust she had lost? Could she repair the damage she had caused, both to herself and to those who depended on her? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, her journey had just begun. And the road ahead would not be an easy one. The officer stepped out of the courtroom, her feet heavy as she made her way through the hallway. The weight of the verdict seemed to follow her, each step a reminder of what had just transpired. The courtroom doors closed behind her with a soft thud, and suddenly, the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. Her thoughts were spinning, still reeling from the judge's words. Her career, something she had worked so hard to build, was now in jeopardy. The suspension was more than just a temporary leave, it was a signal that her actions had consequences far beyond a simple reprimand. The judge had been right, this wasn't just about her failure to respect a superior, it was about everything she had taken for granted. She leaned against the cold stone wall outside the courtroom, trying to gather herself. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence of the hallway engulf her. For years, she had prided herself on being tough, on commanding respect with a single glance. She had become accustomed to the power that came with her badge, with her uniform. But now, standing here, that power seemed so distant. It felt hollow, like it had been stripped away in an instant. As the reality of the suspension settled in, she felt a mix of emotions. There was anger, frustration, and embarrassment, yes, but there was also something else. Something she hadn't expected. A growing sense of regret. The judge had not only suspended her but had challenged the very foundation of her character. And for the first time, she realized how much she had been relying on her authority without truly understanding the responsibility that came with it. The hallway around her was empty, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, but seeing the messages from her colleagues and friends only made her feel more isolated. Some offered sympathy, while others, no doubt, were gossiping about the courtroom drama that had just unfolded. No matter how many messages flooded in, none of them would take away the sinking feeling in her stomach. She walked slowly toward the exit of the building, each step more difficult than the last. The fresh air outside felt oddly sharp, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere she had just left behind. She paused for a moment, taking in the bustling streets around her. Life outside continued as normal. People were going about their days, unaware of the profound change that had just occurred in her life. As she stood there, it became clear to her that this moment was far from just another bump in the road. This was the turning point, the moment when she had to make a choice. the suspension was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in how she would choose to move forward. Her mind wandered to her past, the countless situations she had handled with a sense of entitlement. She had often used her position to assert control, to dominate conversations and decisions. She had always been the one who others looked to for answers, the one who stood tall and demanded respect. But in that courtroom, everything had changed. The judge had looked at her, not as an officer of the law, but as a person who had made a grave mistake. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't invincible. No one was. As the days passed, the officer tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was clear that things were different. Her colleagues treated her with a mixture of sympathy and awkwardness, as if they weren't sure what to say. She had always been seen as a leader among them, someone to look up to. But now, that image had been shattered. They didn't know how to reconcile the confident officer they had once known with the one who had just been publicly humiliated. Even her closest friends, those she had confided in over the years, didn't know how to respond. She had always been the one they could count on, the one who had it all together. But now, she was the one who needed support, and that support was hard to find. There was a growing sense of alienation, and she began to realize how isolated she had become in her own life. She had built walls around herself, walls that had kept people out, and now those same walls were making her feel more alone than ever. The hardest part, however, was the reflection that took place in the quiet moments alone. As she sat in her apartment late at night, the city lights outside offering little comfort, she thought back to the judge's words. "You will have the opportunity for reflection." The words had seemed harsh at the time, but now, they seemed like a lifeline. Maybe this suspension wasn't just a punishment. Maybe it was an opportunity to look inward, to examine the person she had become, and to make the necessary changes. But where to begin? She had spent so much time building a reputation based on authority and respect that she had neglected to cultivate the humility and understanding that truly made a great leader. The arrogance that had been on full display in the courtroom wasn't just a flaw, it was a symptom of something deeper. She had built her life around the belief that power came from external validation, from the uniform, from the badge, from the respect of others. But in the end, none of that mattered if she didn't have respect for herself, and for the very system she had sworn to protect. For the first time, she began to question her own motivations. What had driven her to become an officer in the first place? Was it truly a desire to serve, to protect, to make a difference? Or had it been about the power, the control, the validation that came with wearing the badge? It was a sobering thought. She had always prided herself on being the person who stood up for what was right, who upheld justice and fairness. But her actions in the courtroom had shown her that she hadn't always practiced what she preached. The judge had called her out not just for disrespecting him, but for undermining the very principles she had sworn to uphold. As the days turned into weeks, the officer found herself slowly shifting. She began to make small changes, listening more, speaking less. She reached out to her colleagues, not as a figure of authority, but as a human being who had made a mistake. She had never been good at admitting when she was wrong, but now, she found herself doing just that. She apologized to those she had wronged, not expecting forgiveness, but hoping for understanding. And slowly, things began to shift. The people around her, who had once seen her as a symbol of strength and control, began to see a different side of her. A side that was vulnerable, introspective, and, dare she say it, human. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but she began to rebuild the relationships that had been strained by her arrogance. It wasn't a magical transformation, and it certainly wasn't easy. But with each step, she felt a weight lifting. The suspension had forced her to stop and take a hard look at who she was, and who she wanted to become. She was no longer just the officer in uniform. She was someone who had learned that true power didn't come from a badge or a uniform. It came from humility, from the ability to listen, and from the willingness to grow. It wasn't clear yet if she would ever return to the role she had once held so dearly, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure it mattered. What mattered now was the person she was becoming, the person who understood that real strength came from within, from understanding her own weaknesses and making the choice to improve. As she stood at the crossroads of her career, she knew that the road ahead would be challenging. But it was also one of opportunity, of personal growth. And this time, she wasn't just walking it for herself. She was walking it for everyone who had placed their trust in her, and for everyone she hoped to lead in the future. Weeks passed, and the officer's life had taken on a new, uncertain rhythm. The days were quieter, the sense of control that she once had slowly slipping away. The suspension was in full effect, and it left her with nothing but time to reflect on her actions, on the consequences of her behavior, and on the fractured image of herself that now stared back at her in the mirror. At first, the silence had felt suffocating. She had been used to constant movement, cases, investigations, meetings, the rush of adrenaline that came with her job. Now, all of that had been stripped away. She no longer had the steady schedule of being an officer, no longer had the sense of purpose that came from knowing exactly where she fit into the world. But in that stillness, she began to discover something important. The silence, once unbearable, gave her space to process the aftermath of her actions. She could no longer escape the reality of her situation, nor the ripple effect her disrespect in the courtroom had caused. The officer began to see her role in her failure more clearly, how her arrogance, her need to be right, had blinded her to the responsibility that came with her title. She spent her mornings in self-imposed isolation. She had no one to talk to who truly understood what she was going through. Her colleagues, once allies in the pursuit of justice, now seemed distant and unsure of how to relate to her. Her friends, those who had always looked up to her as a strong and unshakable figure, avoided the topic altogether. Their avoidance only made her feel more like an outsider. But it wasn't just the people around her who had changed, it was also the way she viewed herself. The officer had always prided herself on being someone who could handle any situation, someone who could take charge and never let her emotions cloud her judgment. That confidence had been one of her strongest traits, but now, in the wake of the judge's verdict, she found herself questioning everything. How had she let herself get to this point? What had driven her to disrespect the very system she had dedicated her life to? She had been given an opportunity to reflect, but now the question was, could she truly change? Was she capable of doing the deep work required to turn her life around? The truth was, she didn't know. But one thing was becoming clearer by the day: she couldn't go back to the way things were. She couldn't keep relying on her authority and pride. She had to rebuild herself from the ground up, and that meant confronting the uncomfortable truths about who she had become. It wasn't easy. The officer began to spend her evenings journaling, writing down her thoughts and feelings. She'd never been one for introspection, but something about the act of putting her emotions on paper allowed her to see things in a new light. Each word she wrote seemed to strip away a layer of the walls she had built around herself. She wrote about the arrogance that had once defined her, the insecurities that lay beneath the surface, and the fear that had driven her to overcompensate for her vulnerabilities. The process was painful, but it was also cathartic. She started to understand the roots of her behavior. She had always been driven by the need to be seen as strong, unyielding, and in control. But what she hadn't realized was that this constant need for control was rooted in fear, the fear of being vulnerable, of being seen as weak or fallible. She had been terrified of losing the respect of others, terrified that if she showed any sign of weakness, she would be dismissed, undermined, or overlooked. But now, after everything that had happened, she understood that real strength wasn't about maintaining an image of perfection. Real strength came from vulnerability, from acknowledging one's flaws, and from learning to grow in the face of adversity. The officer had been running from her own vulnerability for years, but now, in the quiet moments of reflection, she realized that it was only by embracing it that she could move forward. However, no matter how much she reflected, no matter how many realizations she had, she still faced the undeniable consequences of her actions. Her suspension was not just a symbolic gesture, it had real-world implications. The longer she stayed out of the force, the more she risked losing her place among her colleagues, her identity as an officer, and her standing within the community she had once served so confidently. The officer knew that, despite the inner work she was doing, she still had to face the world and its judgment. Her suspension wasn't indefinite. It was a temporary pause in her career, but the fear of how her return would be received lingered in her mind. Would her colleagues accept her back? Would the community ever trust her again? Could she regain the respect she had once commanded, or had she lost it for good? It was in these moments of doubt that she thought back to the judge's final words. This is not just a punishment, it is an opportunity for reflection. At the time, those words had felt like a sentence, like a judgment. But now, the officer realized that they were not just about the past, they were about the future. The judge had given her a chance to rebuild, to find her way back to what truly mattered. And so, slowly but surely, the officer began to reach out. She sent a message to a fellow officer, someone she had once trusted but had distanced herself from after the suspension. It was a simple message: "I owe you an apology. Can we talk?" It was humbling to put herself in that position, but it was the only way forward. If she wanted to regain what she had lost, she had to be willing to face the people she had wronged. The conversation wasn't easy. She sat across from her colleague in a small cafe, the weight of the conversation making the air thick with tension. Her colleague, once warm and supportive, now seemed distant, unsure of how to respond. The officer apologized, not just for her actions in the courtroom, but for the way she had let her pride and arrogance influence her decisions. She admitted that she had been wrong, that she had failed to live up to the values she had always claimed to uphold. Her colleague listened, nodding slowly, but said very little. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was also the first step toward healing. When the officer finished speaking, her colleague finally responded, "It's going to take time. But I appreciate you saying this. I think we all have work to do." It wasn't an easy forgiveness, but it was a step forward. The officer left the cafe with a mix of relief and trepidation. She had taken responsibility for her actions, but the path to redemption would not be quick or easy. She still had to prove herself, not just to her colleagues, but to herself. As she walked back to her apartment, the officer couldn't help but reflect on how much she had changed in such a short period of time. Her journey had only just begun, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. She wasn't sure where this path would lead her, but she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer the person she had been when she walked into that courtroom. The woman who had once been blinded by pride and arrogance was gone, and in her place was someone who was ready to rebuild and make things right. The consequences of her actions had been severe, but they had also opened her eyes to the person she needed to become. And no matter how long it took, the officer was determined to walk that road, step by difficult step. Time had passed, but the officer's journey was still far from over. While her suspension had been a wake-up call, it was clear that the real work lay ahead. The months that followed were filled with small victories and setbacks, moments of growth and frustration, and an overwhelming desire to prove herself not only to her colleagues and the community but, more importantly, to herself. The officer continued to focus on her self-reflection, finding ways to stay grounded through the process. She spent more time volunteering at local charities, using her background in law enforcement to help those in need. It wasn't a way to regain respect in the traditional sense, but it was something deeper, a way to connect with people in a meaningful, humble way. Every day, she sought out new opportunities to show up as a better person, someone who acted not out of pride but from a genuine desire to make a difference. Despite these small changes, however, the shadows of her past behavior still lingered. She knew that no matter how much time had passed, the community wouldn't forget the arrogance she had once displayed in the courtroom. She had embarrassed herself, her colleagues, and the institution she had worked for. And she knew the road to redemption would be long. But it was during one of her charity events, a program designed to help troubled youth, that she began to notice the first signs of change. She had been paired with a young man named Jake, a teenager who had gotten into trouble with the law on more than one occasion. At first, Jake had been cold and distant toward her, barely looking her in the eye. He was angry and defensive, much like the officer had been in the past. He didn't trust her, why should he? To him, she was just another person in authority who had come to tell him what to do, to judge him without understanding his struggles. But over the weeks, as they spent more time together, something shifted. The officer approached Jake with patience and empathy, not trying to force him to change or judge him for his mistakes but instead listening to him. She shared parts of her own story, talking about her own struggles with pride, the mistakes she had made, and how she was working to become a better person. Slowly, she saw the walls around Jake start to crumble. He began to open up to her, telling her about his own dreams, his own fears. And in those moments of vulnerability, something profound happened. The officer realized that the very thing she had feared most, vulnerability, was the key to connecting with others. She had spent so much of her life hiding behind a facade of invincibility, thinking that strength came from control. But true strength, she now understood, came from allowing others to see her flaws and weaknesses. It came from being willing to grow, to listen, and to put others first. And, in turn, it allowed others to trust and open up to her in ways that had once seemed impossible. Jake's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was genuine. He started to show more interest in the community programs, attending sessions regularly, and even taking on leadership roles in some of the activities. For the officer, the changes in Jake were a reflection of her own growth. She was beginning to realize that redemption wasn't a one-time event. It was a process. A constant, evolving process of learning, making mistakes, and finding ways to be better. One evening, as the two of them were sitting together after a session, Jake looked at her and said, "I didn't think you were like the others. You didn't treat me like I was just some criminal. You listened." The officer's heart swelled. She had expected this to be a one-sided endeavor, but in reality, she had received just as much from Jake as he had from her. He had reminded her that the path to healing, to redemption, was never just about fixing what was broken, it was about creating real connections, about meeting people where they were and showing them that change was possible. But as much as she had begun to change, the officer knew that she couldn't ignore the outside world forever. Her suspension was nearing its end, and soon she would have to face her colleagues, her superiors, and the entire law enforcement community. Would they accept the new version of her, or would they see only the woman who had disrespected the judge in that courtroom so long ago? The officer found herself standing in front of the mirror once more, just days before she was scheduled to return to her position. Her uniform hung in the closet, the badge shining back at her like a challenge. She had always looked at that badge as a symbol of authority, but now, it felt different. It wasn't a symbol of power, it was a symbol of responsibility. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to wear it again. The self-doubt began to creep in, as it always did before moments of change. Could she really return to the force and make a difference? Was she ready to take on the role of officer again, knowing that so much had changed about her perspective? The officer knew there were no guarantees. She couldn't erase her past mistakes, and she couldn't predict how people would react to her return. But one thing was clear, she had learned valuable lessons in humility, patience, and empathy. She had grown as a person, and she was no longer defined by her previous arrogance. She decided to reach out to a former mentor, someone who had guided her when she first joined the force. This mentor had always been someone who believed in the power of second chances, and the officer needed that reminder now more than ever. She sent a message asking if they could meet. When they met at a small diner the next day, the officer felt a wave of gratitude as her mentor greeted her with a warm smile. "I've been hearing good things about you," the mentor said, sitting down across from her. "I know it's been a tough few months, but I've seen a real change in you. You're doing the right thing, working through your mistakes and learning from them." The officer smiled, though it was a bittersweet expression. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for what I did. I don't know if people will ever see me the way they once did." Her mentor leaned forward, hands folded on the table. "People don't forget easily. But they do respect those who are willing to do the work. You've put in that work. You've shown growth, and that's what matters. Don't focus so much on what people think, focus on the person you're becoming." The officer took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. She had always worried about her reputation, about what others thought of her. But now, she realized that her true test wasn't about regaining their respect, it was about respecting herself. It was about living in a way that was true to her values, no matter how long it took for others to catch up. The conversation with her mentor gave her the clarity she needed. She wasn't returning to her position as the officer who had disrespected a judge. She was returning as a new person, someone who had learned from her mistakes and was committed to doing better. As the officer prepared to step back into her role, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had taken the first steps toward rebuilding her career, her reputation, and her life. And this time, she was determined to do it right. The first day back on the job felt surreal to the officer. She stood at the entrance of the precinct, the familiar smell of coffee and printer ink filling the air. The same old bulletin board with notices and memos caught her eye. She had walked through these doors countless times before, but today felt different. She was no longer the confident officer who had once worn her badge like armor. Today, she was the officer who had to prove herself again, to show that she had learned from her mistakes. The uniform she wore was the same as before, but as she fastened her badge onto her chest, it felt heavier, more meaningful. It no longer represented just authority, but a deep responsibility, a commitment to the people she was sworn to protect. As she adjusted her collar, she found herself taking a deep breath, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. The hallway was bustling with the usual activity, officers in their own worlds, discussing cases, sharing information, laughing with one another. When they saw her, their eyes briefly met hers, and she could tell that some weren't sure what to expect. The air felt thick with judgment and uncertainty. She had always prided herself on being a leader in the precinct, someone others looked up to. But now, the tables had turned. She was the one on the outside, the one who had to prove that she was worthy of the respect she had once taken for granted. Her first few hours back were a blur. She wasn't assigned to any high-profile cases or even given the authority she had once enjoyed. Instead, she was stuck with routine tasks, menial assignments, things that weren't glamorous but were important nonetheless. She understood why. It wasn't that her colleagues didn't trust her, it was that they needed to see if she had truly changed. They needed to witness her humility, her willingness to work from the ground up again. She spent the day completing reports, answering calls, and handling minor incidents. At first, the mundane nature of the work felt humbling, and there were moments when she couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. This wasn't how she had envisioned her return. She had imagined stepping back into action, taking charge, and showing everyone that she was still capable of making an impact. But this was not about showing off her skills, it was about rebuilding trust, one small task at a time. But as the day went on, she began to realize something: this work was just as important as anything she had done before. The routine, the small acts of service, were the foundation of everything that mattered in law enforcement. The respect she had once sought from others would only come through consistent, dedicated effort, not through flashy displays of authority. She had to earn it back, step by step, just as she had done with Jake in the community program. Her colleagues' reactions were mixed. Some nodded at her as she walked past, giving her a brief acknowledgement, while others exchanged glances that she couldn't quite decipher. The officer knew that it would take time to regain their trust, but she was prepared for that. She had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it had to be earned, and sometimes, it took years. By the end of her first shift, she was exhausted, but it was a good kind of exhaustion. She had done the work. She had shown up. The officer had walked into that precinct unsure of what to expect, but as she left that evening, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The day had been a small victory, a quiet testament to the fact that she was on the right path. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Her tasks remained small, her interactions with colleagues cautious and polite. There were no major breakthroughs, no dramatic moments of redemption. But with each passing day, the officer felt herself growing more comfortable in her new role. She wasn't the star anymore. She wasn't the one everyone relied on for answers or quick solutions. But that was okay. She understood now that being an officer wasn't about taking the lead in every situation, it was about working alongside others, listening, supporting, and learning. Her colleagues began to notice the shift in her behavior. She no longer rushed to offer solutions or assert her dominance in conversations. She took a step back and allowed others to contribute, giving credit where it was due. She apologized when necessary, showing vulnerability and a willingness to grow. Slowly, the walls that had been built around her began to crumble. They started to see her for who she truly was, a person who had made a mistake but was willing to do the hard work to make things right. But the real test came one afternoon, when a situation arose that required quick thinking and decisive action. A robbery in progress had been reported in a nearby convenience store, and the precinct mobilized quickly. Officers were dispatched to the scene, and the officer found herself in the middle of the action once more. For a moment, she felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. This was her element, the chaos of the real world, where decisions had to be made in the blink of an eye. As the officers surrounded the store, she took charge of the perimeter, ensuring that no one escaped. She coordinated with her colleagues and kept her cool under pressure. It felt good to be back in the thick of it, to feel the weight of the badge once more. As the situation unfolded, the officer's years of training and experience kicked in. She remained focused and clear-headed, giving orders where needed, keeping everyone calm, and ensuring that no harm came to anyone involved. In the end, the robbery was resolved without violence, and the suspects were apprehended. It was a textbook operation, efficient, precise, and successful. Afterward, as the officers stood around debriefing, one of her colleagues turned to her and said, "Nice job. You kept it together out there." The compliment was simple, but it hit her harder than she expected. For the first time since her suspension, she felt a genuine sense of respect from her colleagues. They had seen her in action, and they had witnessed her dedication, her professionalism, and her ability to handle pressure. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start. As she walked back to the precinct, her mind replayed the events of the day. She had proven to herself, and to her colleagues, that she still had what it took. But more importantly, she had learned that it wasn't the big moments that defined her, it was the way she handled the everyday challenges, the way she interacted with those around her, and the humility she carried with her. That night, as she sat at home, the officer reflected on her journey. She had come a long way since that fateful day in the courtroom. She had faced the consequences of her actions, but she had also found a new sense of purpose. The arrogant, prideful officer was gone. In her place was someone who had learned the value of humility, patience, and empathy. Someone who understood that true strength came from within, from the willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more challenges to face. But the officer knew that she was no longer defined by her past mistakes. She had a new beginning, a fresh start, and the opportunity to build something better, not just for herself, but for everyone who depended on her. With each day, the officer moved closer to the person she had always wanted to be, the person who could lead not with arrogance, but with understanding, not with pride, but with humility. And, in time, she knew that the respect she had once sought would come, not because it was demanded, but because it was earned through genuine change and dedication to serving others.